Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you're based. My name is Arthur, and I'm thrilled today to be moderating this webinar covering maritime trading and risk analysis in a volatile environment. Now, a few housekeeping rules before we start. The webinar should last approximately 30 minutes, with about 10-15 minutes for live Q&A at the end. Don't hesitate to send your questions throughout the webinar, though, in the Q&A box reserved for this purpose. I'm now going to let the speakers introduce themselves and the companies which they represent, starting with Sophia. Over to you.
Hi, thanks, Arthur. I'm Sophia Vargas. I'm an analyst at C4ADS on our Organized Crime and Grand Corruption Cell. And I'll be talking a little bit about our report on Venezuelan oil shipments after US sanctions that came out in July 2020.
Thank you, Sophia. Over to you, Michael.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Horowitz, the head of commercial product marketing at Windward. And I'm going to be talking about an analysis we actually did in partnership with Vortexa on the behavior of the Venezuelan tanker fleet after sanctions were in place, taking a global look at it.
Thank you, Michael. As for myself, I lead the freight market coverage here at Vortexa. Now, without further ado, looking at our agenda, the first part will be focused on the current sanctions environment on the Venezuelan oil sector, while part two, as Michael hinted at, will look at the findings of a joint Vortexa Windward report entitled The Interwoven Global Tanker Trade. Then we'll finish with a summary of the key messages of this presentation and a brief outlook of what to expect. I'm now going to pass on to Sophia for the first part of this presentation.
Thanks, Arthur. So C4ADS came out with a report in July 2020, taking a look at the effects of US sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector by specifically focusing on tanker vessel activity in Venezuelan waters. So this kind of sets the stage pretty well for Windward and Vortexa's excellent report that just came out. If you go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the context in which we wrote our report. So as many of you might already know, the US sanctioned PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, in January 28, 2019, under Executive Order 13850, in order to attempt to put pressure on the Maduro regime in Venezuela. This led to subsequent designations by OFAC of tanker vessels operating in the Venezuelan oil sector, some belonging to PDVSA and its subsidiaries, and some not, for transporting Venezuelan crude oil or oil products to Venezuela. Over the course of these actions in 2019 and 2020, OFAC designated about 28 tanker vessels and 18 shipping companies, but has subsequently delisted many entities for either complying with sanctions or cutting contracts with PDVSA. If you go to the next slide. So C4ADS decided to do an analysis on the effects of these sanctions by looking at AIS activity in Venezuelan waters the year before sanctions took place and the year after sanctions took place to have a side-by-side comparison. The way we did this analysis is by incorporating AIS data from Windward, corporate network data from IHS Markit, and structuring all of that data using Palantir Gotham and Palantir Foundry. So in terms of data collection, we used port call activity as well as dark activity data within the Venezuelan EEZ to collect a list of vessels that were active in Venezuelan waters between January 28th, 2018, starting the year before sanctions, and January 28th, 2020, the year after sanctions. So we had 2 years of port call data and in Venezuelan waters. And what we got as a result from that were 924 tanker vessels active in Venezuelan waters in that period of 2 years. We pulled their underlying corporate ownership structures and found over 1,200 entities linked to these vessels of interest. And like I said, we structured that all in Palantir, Gotham, and Foundry to discover trends related to the effects of sanctions on these sorts of networks. Next slide. So our results in terms of corporate networks, this is kind of a complicated slide, but bear with me in how I explain it. But what we found were, like I said, 924 vessels active in Venezuelan waters in those 2 years. Exclusively the year before sanctions, we found 580 vessels linked to over 800 commercial organizations active exclusively in that year before sanctions. There were 130 vessels active in both of the years, the year before sanctions and the year after sanctions, and then finally 214 that we saw active only in the year after sanctions. So overall, what we're drawing from that is that the number of vessels openly making port calls in the Venezuelan exclusive economic zone went down pretty significantly after the US imposed sanctions on PDVSA. This sets a backdrop to Windward and Vortex's analysis into the global tanker trade and kind of where, you know, these vessels go after leaving Venezuelan waters and their behavior at sea. If you go to the next slide. Specifically, what we saw within Venezuelan waters, however, was also not only a drop in the number of unique vessels operating in the Venezuelan EEZ, but also a drop in the number of port calls being made with AIS turned on. And so what we saw was we saw around 46% drop in the number of port calls made in over 20 ports in Venezuela by tanker vessels. So as you can note, Jose Oil Terminal, for example, one of Venezuela's most important export terminals for crude oil, saw much less activity, almost half of a drop in port calls from 1 year to the next. So that's a little bit of background from our report. You can feel free to check it out on our website at c4ads.org. It came out in July 2020. And now I'll pass it on to Arthur and Michael.
Thank you, Sophia, for setting the scene in such an excellent way. Now, just to give our viewers a bit of background, Vortexa and Windward partnered in October 2020 of this year to really bring the shipping industry and to back the shipping industry with AI-backed analytics. And we decided to apply the potential of our combined capabilities to this Venezuelan trade and to the fleet associated with it, and to kind of show how that interlinked with maritime risk. Now, whilst part one was focused on what was going on within Venezuela, and especially within those port calls, we're really trying to now set it within a global context. We analyzed oil flows between October 2019 and October 2020 to and from Venezuela, and then found that 208 unique tankers had been involved in this fleet. Now, this is for tankers ranging from handy-size sizes and above. If we look at our first set of results here, well, the conclusion is really that the Venezuelan oil trade is global. If we look at associated ship owners and managers for this fleet, they hail from 28 countries, which you can see highlighted in blue on the map on the right-hand side. The oil itself flows to about 24 unique destinations. Now, the companies transporting and trading these cargoes are really an integral part of the global oil flows, and this sheer interconnectedness of this maritime ecosystem is not a result of sanctions on any trade, but it's really the nature of the maritime industry. And that's something important to keep in mind. Now, within that fleet, only about 10% even less actually, based on Sophia's latest update on the sanctioned tankers, are actually sanctioned. But it shows that a much greater percentage are potentially at risk of sanctions. Now, Michael, some participants are actively trying to conceal their activities. That's a fact. So could you help us shine a light on the dark trade of a portion of this fleet?
Definitely. If you can move to the next slide. So like Arthur said, it's fairly straightforward to see the who is involved in this trade. However, what they are actually doing, both within the Venezuelan waters and after that, is a bit trickier. And so what we did with Vortex is we used Windward's algorithms for figuring out dark activity, meaning deliberate turning off of AIS in order to conceal activity. This shouldn't be confused, by the way, with lost AIS transmissions, which is much more common. And we focused on those deliberate AIS turnoffs. And what we found was really interesting. One is, as you would expect, there is a large concentration right off the coast of Venezuela. But what we also see is there are other areas of concentrations, such as the Eastern Mediterranean, Gulf, and Malaysia. These are areas that are known for sanctions risk. Eastern Mediterranean because of Syria and Crimea, the Gulf obviously because of Iran, and Malaysia as a ship-to-ship hub, which we'll talk about more in later. So we see that these activities are not just happening in Venezuela, but they're happening globally. The next thing we found, which was really surprising and interesting, was that 80% of this fleet had at least one dark activity. Many were actually repeat offenders. And when we compare that with the global tanker fleet, that's significantly higher. And you should know that the global tanker fleet also has a high rate of dark activities compared to other commercial vessels, such as container ships and bulk cargo. So this is really interesting that they had such a high rate of dark activity. So I think that we can move to the next slide where we talk about other risks besides for dark activities. Arthur, did you want to add something here?
I just wanted to summarize. So dark activity then is basically AIS manipulation to sort of hide, to conceal where the ship was. But what other types of activities exist out there?
For sure. So if you can go to the next slide. So like Arthur mentioned, what's interesting about this fleet is it's legitimate. It's less than 10% are on a sanctions list, which on the one hand is good. On the other hand, actually exposes other participants in the trade outside of Venezuela to a risk because these ships on the surface do not appear to be at risk of being sanctioned. In fact, what we found was many of them do not even have a port call in Venezuela, at least what can be seen readily using a vessel tracker software. What they do have are, as we mentioned, dark activities. Many have ship-to-ship, so that are taking on cargo from Venezuela. And they are also spending a large amount of time in Venezuelan waters, perhaps in order to do a dark ship-to-ship, which is a ship-to-ship that we cannot detect because the other ship is turning off their transmission. What's interesting here is that there are many more ships passing through Venezuelan waters, many more tankers actually. Vortexa can talk about the global flows and why that is. But what's important to note here is that only 1 out of 5 of those tankers are actually taking on Venezuelan cargo, which puts us in an interesting situation where if we look at just port calls, then we're going to be missing some of these ships that are taking on cargo. But if we expand the net too far and say, well, let's look at all these the tankers that are in Venezuelan waters, well, then we would actually be catching a lot of false flags, false positives rather, and that would obviously be also not desirable. So it's a bit of a walking a fine line between these two extremes.
Just to add a bit more context to what you mentioned about the flows, it's indeed a very busy traffic lane, so to speak, especially the US Gulf to LATAM route sees a lot of tankers transiting there. So it's kind of easy to maybe get lost among those and loiter around Venezuela. If we can hone in specifically on ship-to-ship, you mentioned earlier that Malaysia was an STS hotspot. Are there any other trends that you'd like to present?
Yes. So if you move to the next slide, we saw several very interesting patterns in the ship-to-ships. One is, as you mentioned, the tankers that were visiting and taking on Venezuelan cargo actually were doing ship-to-ships in Malaysia at a much higher rate than the typical tanker, actually 2.5 times more likely. So obviously tanker, in general, this is a ship-to-ship hotspot, but Venezuelan tankers were even more likely to be having meeting in this specific area. The second thing worth mentioning is while AIS manipulation is probably hiding some of these ship-to-ship transfers, even the ones we were catching showed that there are 3 times as many ships potentially connected to the Venezuelan trade than again you would see by just looking at the visits to the Venezuelan area or the port calls. So that's something to keep in mind, this second order analysis, where you look at the ships that are meeting with those ships and potentially taking on cargo. And that's a hidden risk that we need to take into account as well. And the third thing I wanted to mention was what some call oil laundering, playing off the concept of money laundering, where criminals layer different, sometimes innocent and sometimes not, entities in between the origins of the ill-gotten gains and the final destination. And so what happens with oil laundering is a similar idea where the ships actually do conduct multiple ship-to-ship transfers in order so that when the cargo finally arrives at its final destination, it's quite difficult to trace that chain of custody and understand where it came from. So those are some really interesting findings we found out when we looked at this, when we looked at the global patterns of behavior of this ship.
It is indeed fascinating. And for the increase in STS meetings in Malaysian waters for these cargoes, we found out that a lot of the buyers were Chinese or from Malaysia. So that could explain potentially that. Or it could simply be the fact that it's about hiding those STS meetings amongst plenty of others. And like you say, lead to the concept of oil laundering. Now, moving on to part 3, really to summarize what we've been trying to say. First, I'm going to take a step back and show viewers that what we're looking at is very much ingrained in current news. These slides were set up in the last 2 or 3 days, and all these headlines are from the past week. And we can see that it's very much at the forefront of the markets, at the forefront of the news. So more than ever, with that global scrutiny on these flows and on these tankers, do market participants want to have the right data in order to understand what's going on, and if that is the case, protect themselves from that maritime risk? The key messages taken from parts 1 and 2 that we really wanted to leave our audience with. Well, first of all, Venezuela flows are an integral part of global volumes, and that is because it's one of the world's major producers of crudes, and the sheer interconnectedness, once more, of the maritime industry, it's not going to be any other way. Companies may be indirectly involved and not aware of the risks that they're exposed to, which is something that Windward is really trying to help market participants tackle, because as we can see, whether we assign the risk to that tanker or to that cargo, it can really contaminate the supply chain. And data insights are needed to make sense of these false positives and hidden risks, both from a cargo and a vessel point of view. When it comes to US sanctions, well, we do have an oil and maritime sector in the crosshairs. Venezuela is not isolated, and its oil and shipping industries are not isolated as targets of US sanctions. But maybe contrary to Iran or to the DPRK, it hasn't necessarily led to its isolation from the global economy. Now, there's a number of factors there that we can think about. Maybe it's because of the sheer size Maybe it's because Venezuela, as part of Latin America, is not maybe in a situation as complex as that of Iran within the Middle East, involving other players as well. Or it hasn't been isolated for that long compared to the DPRK. But these are oral questions up for debate. Thank you for being with us. Now, this marks the end of our presentation, and I'll now stop sharing my screen and open up the floor to questions from the audience. So, we have a question here for C4DS. Would you say that sanctions against Venezuela were effective, or the market doesn't really care?
So, as we've seen just in the sheer number of, a drop in activity, at least that we could gather from AIS data within Venezuelan waters, I don't know if effective is the term to use, but there has been a shock, at least in just what unilateral sanctions from the U.S. onto Venezuela's oil sector has made. It's changed behavior of even foreign entities involved. I mean, there have been registered owners, ship managers from countries not Venezuela, so foreign entities involved in the Venezuelan oil trade that have been designated by OFAC. So in that sense, it's I think created a sense of risk and perhaps maybe even some uncertainty or confusion in how these sanctions actually play out, who will actually be designated for operating in the Venezuelan oil sector. I mean, it's really been this executive order that has taken the lead in designating Venezuelan tankers, but it's clearly had rippling effects. Even though, like Arthur mentioned, the oil trade in Venezuela hasn't exactly been isolated the way other cases of multilateral or even unilateral sanctions have been in other countries. So yeah, that's kind of what we've seen, at least.
Thank you, Sophia. One for you, Michael. Is it possible to explain a little how the dark activity is detected by Windward?
Yes, love to do that. And it's worth mentioning that afterwards I can certainly share some of the materials we prepared on that as well. So a little bit of a background on AIS, just a brief one, because many people here are probably familiar with it, but it is a system used for basically transmitting the location of the vessel, primarily for safety purposes. But what organizations have realized is that it's also possible to use it for tracking for other purposes, such as compliance and risk management. And the challenge is that AIS as a technology, as a protocol, is noisy. It takes a lot of work to clean it up. And on the other side, there are areas where the coverage is not so strong. And what that leads to is what we call lost AIS signals, basically where the vessel's location for a problem with AIS is not known. And these sometimes are called going dark. Now, Windward saw the challenge that our clients were having with these AIS transmission gaps where they could not see where the vessel was. And obviously in light of the recent OFAC recommendations around due diligence around AIS gaps, this was simply a challenge that was not humanly possible, especially for our clients with larger fleets, with tight deadlines for clearing ships. And so the dark activity algorithm basically crunches a lot of different factors, such as where the ship is, what the coverage of the AIS is at the time, what type of ship it is, and basically asks three questions. One is this a lost AIS signal? In other words, is this an area where many ships tend to lose their signal because of issues with overcrowding or weak coverage. Number two, did the ship have enough time while it was dark in order to actually do something of interest? So that's looking at the ship itself and where it is, and of course the unaccounted for time, which is basically the time from the start location to the end location, and how much time the ship could have done that in versus how long it actually took. And that unaccounted for time is used to figure out, was there any feasible trade, which is the third aspect. In other words, could it have called it a port? Could it have done a ship to ship? And so that's kind of simplifying a really complicated AI algorithm. But what it helps to do is it takes the number down 20 to 10 times the number of lost signals to dark activity. So that's clearing a ton of false positives for our clients. And that's why it's such a crucial piece of your AIS due diligence process, to really differentiate between those lost AIS signals versus the dark activity.
Thank you, Michael. You've actually answered a couple of questions in there. Everyone wondering how you did it. We have one regarding the vessel sizes that are involved in this trade, and I'm gonna take this one. So the Vortexa Windward analysis, which you can find on both on our respective websites with the full findings, identified that 23% of the total fleet were VLCCs. Now that makes sense with regards to the crude exports, and for that category, these were the cargoes that were exported the most. For the economies of scale, you see that the buyers are located as well in Asia. But what is maybe more interesting to talk about is how more than 50% of that fleet were tankers aged 15 years or more. So here we have both a push and pull effect. It probably means due to their age that these tankers are not oil major approved anymore, so can't operate, let's say, in more regulated markets. And at the same time, it shows a sort of willingness from those involved in that trade to really employ tankers that get the job done. So these are 2 points to take into account. We have a question here with regards to how we expect the situation to change once the new US administration is sworn in with regards to Venezuela, if we expect it to change at all. Sophia, if you want to take this one.
Sure. I mean, I don't really have an answer to that, mostly because there have already been, or the designations that took place on tankers have already, started to quiet down. I'm not sure if there will be as much of a maritime focus anymore, given the trend, that we've been seeing, and that there were more tankers being designated in 2019, a little bit in 2020, but kind of in the first half of the year, and now haven't seen it as much of late. So I don't know what that means for the next administration, but clearly, I mean, those designations that already took place have already had an impact. Whether or not, those sorts of actions are reversed in the future.
Thank you. Michael, back to you. We have a question from a viewer that'd like to know, how advanced are the vessels in spoofing AIS, and are they able to fake their position so we aren't able to pick up the dark activity?
Yeah, this is really interesting. This is something we've seen in a few different areas. I think we saw it in China areas a bit. I think we saw it near Crimea. These spoofing their positions. It's pretty isolated in terms of the numbers that are doing it, but they definitely show up as an anomaly. And that's really the key here, is to think about not to be able to look at every single dot of data and each individual ship, but really to have an idea of what is the behavior of a ship that looks like this. What should it look like? And to be able to flag that anomaly. And so if you are able to look at, okay, a ship of this size in this area, this age, et cetera, running this route, is it behaving in a typical way or is it different? And if it's different, why? That enables you to ask those questions and get to the bottom of it. So not to answer the question directly because it depends on the individual case, but if a ship is behaving differently from its pattern of life or from what the standard peer would look, peership would look like, then that would definitely be flagged, and then you can investigate further. And trust me, when you see this on a map, it's very obvious what's happening. And it's you have to ask the question. Obviously it could be caught up in something else. I think, again, I'm not an expert on this, but we've seen, ships that are actually not doing anything themselves. They just somehow got caught up in some other spoofing happening. But you would then ask that question and be able to get to the bottom of that. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Michael. We have another question. If dark activity is known and identified, why isn't it properly sanctioned? I'm not sure who wants to jump in and comment on that.
I can't answer as to the actions of the US government and other countries, but what I can say is that I want to be very clear. When Windward talks about dark activity, we are not talking about something that's necessarily illicit. This is Windward, like going back to that previous point I made, Windward flagging an unusual behavior, a behavior that doesn't really make economic sense and is actually against basically the way ships should behave at sea in a safe way. And once that's flagged and the details are given, in such as where it's happening and how long, et cetera, then the person who's receiving that information, be it a ship owner or a charterer or a trader, can make that informed decision. Do they want to further investigate, or do they actually know why this is happening? So dark activity is a signal to basically to further investigate, and not necessarily something which is sanctionable by itself. So should give a further context there.
No, I think it was very important that you made that distinction there, that dark activity doesn't necessarily equal illicit. And similar to the fleet we identified performing those trades and involved in those Venezuela flows, a lot of them, right up to the sanctions, had certain agreements in place, product for crude swaps, and were not engaging willingly into any sort of illicit behavior.
Yeah, I think actually it goes back to a point you made before about understanding the situation and kind of making an informed decision. Companies want to take a risk-based approach. In order to do that, you need to truly understand your exposure to risks. What decision you make afterwards with that information, that's already depends on the risk appetite of the company and like you said, all those other factors. So it's about being informed and understanding the exposure.
Which is why that is our goal at the end of the day. It's being able to provide those insights to the market, whether from a risk point of view, whether from a flows or tanker point of view, and even to companies that analyze the sanction environment or that have a say in the legal framework surrounding these issues. They'll only be able to make the best decisions if they really have the right information. We have a question that might be hard to answer, but we can give it a shot. In reference to oil laundering, what's the most number of times you've seen a cargo being STS'd? I'm going to say a lot, but Michael, if you have any more precise numbers.
I don't know if I've ever asked that question. I can certainly ask one of our domain experts here and try to get back. What I can say in general is that what's interesting about ship to ship is it's a completely legitimate way of transferring cargo. There's nothing suspicious, again, about a ship to ship by itself. It's who is involved and what the cargo is and where is it happening and the broader context. And so I think what's really cool about the partnership with Vortex is that we're able to actually track a cargo across ships, not just the ships themselves. So maybe Vortex and Windward will partner together and try and figure out the Guinness Book of World Records number of times a cargo has been transferred.
That would be an interesting analysis. And on the part about Windward being able to track really cargoes, one other interesting finding within our report is what we did is we assigned the risk level of these tankers that had carried that cargo. We kind of transferred that risk assessment to the cargo. And then we saw the different risk levels of these cargoes ranging from sanction to high and to low. Now, why were some of them low? Well, because, correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, but the Windward risk assessment does change if no dark activity was engaged in over a certain period of time. So what we actually saw is that a proportion of that fleet had cleaned up its act, so to speak. So maybe closer to October 2019 had been involved in that trade, but since had stayed clear. So it did have an impact there.
Yeah, I think it's a great point about the look back period and how these things change and they're so dynamic. And actually, Sophia's, I think, study was a great example of that, to show that there were a fair number of ships and companies that didn't continue to trade with Venezuela. And then actually, Sophia, I think if you want to explain more that really cool diagram, but basically talk about that, I think the number of ships that actually jumped into Venezuela after the sanctions were, I thought that was interesting.
Exactly, yeah, and it's detailed a little more in our report, but there were about 100 tankers that appeared in Venezuelan waters for the first time after sanctions took place, meaning there are entities out there that are either more willing to take on risk or might not be, connected to the US financial system and therefore, at lower risk of sanctions. I'm not really sure, but what we gathered from that is that newly, ships newly entering this sector are interesting to understand and to observe and see that even within a sanctions environment, you still see new actors at play. And yeah, overall we saw around 300 or so vessels in the year after sanctions that made port calls in Venezuela, and a portion of those newly entering that sort of activity.
Thank you both. I think we've come to the end of the open questions. If any of our viewers have any more questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can find our contact details on our respective websites. Otherwise, I'm going to close this off, and thank you, Sophia, for your time, and thank you, Michael, as well, for coming together and presenting this to our viewers. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to speaking with you soon.
Have a great day and great night.
Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.